Our parents didn't split up, you might be crowing. You're lucky in that respect, Alan. I shake my head slowly and smile. You see, my parents' marriage wasn't as stable as their long list of wedding anniversaries might suggest, and that in itself was unusual and upsetting. Of course, these days, the institution of marriage is in crisis. It's crumbling like an OXO cube. I don't have the exact figures to hand, but it's probably correct to say that half of all marriages end in separation. Take the royal family. Elizabeth and Philip, solid as a rock. Charles and Diana, crumbled like an OXO cube. Charles and Camilla, rock. Andrew and Fergie, OXO. Edward and his wife, rock. Anne and Mark Phillips, OXO. You see, exactly 1 in 2. Marriage is dead, I shouted to the listeners of Mid-Morning Matters not 6 weeks ago. Then I paused for dramatic effect and to finish my mouthful of sandwich. Someone inform the relatives. Time of death, 2011. Cause of death? Well, why don't you play Quincy? Get in touch and let us know why you think marriage passed away. It turned out to be a really insightful phone-in. Dealing with unemployed listeners 5 days a week, I'm still sometimes pleasantly surprised that they can be brainy. Regular caller Ralph laid the blame at the door of the Mormons. Other less angry listeners put it down to the rise of contraception, E-numbers giving us attention deficit, and tax law, while my assistant texted in to say it was a symptom of terrible ungodliness. Me, I put it down to a combination of all these factors, apart from the one about ungodliness and the one about Mormons. Whatever your view, in the last 100 years there must have been more divorces than marriages. 50 years ago, things were kind of different, though. It was as rare to see a divorce as it was to see a four-leaf clover or a black chap in a position of authority. If only things had stayed that way. I mean about divorces. Now, I thought my parents' union was in the rock-solid camp, but I was wrong, because one night something happened that threatened to turn my world upside down like one of those paperweights with fake snow inside. It was an incident that made me have a terrible, terrible thought. What if the rock of their marriage was actually a rock made of OXO? I woke with a start. At first I'd assumed I'd trumped myself awake again. It was the summertime, so there were lots of fresh vegetables in our diet. But as I listened through the darkness, I realized that something far worse was going on. My mother and father were having the row to end all rows. A sudden shot of fear ripped through my pre-pubic body, and now I did do a trump. The noise fizzed out of my back passage like a child calling for help. That child was me. I cupped my hands behind my ears, creating a sort of makeshift amplifier. Look and Learn magazine was right. It really did work. But I still couldn't quite hear everything. I shut my eyes in the hope that it might make me hear better, like they say it does for blind people. I've told you there's no point keeping those. They're not tax-deductible, my dad thundered. I think you'll find they are, raged my mum, like some sort of feral animal, brackets a badger with TB, perhaps. They're not. You only get VAT back on lunches outside a 50-mile radius from your place of residence, you effing bitch, he seemed to add with his eyes, I imagined. All right, fine. I'll get rid of them then, sobbed my mum, her fight gone, her spirit crushed like a Stew Francis grape. Then the door was shut. Or was it slammed? It was hard to know for sure, as I'd now opened my eyes, thus depriving myself of the hearing boost conferred on me by blindness. I curled up on my bed like a fetus, though admittedly quite a large one, and I cried like a baby, again large. Please, Lord, make it stop, I snivelled. I'll do anything you ask of me, within reason and subject to getting permission from my mum. Just don't let them break up. Like an OXO cube, I could have added. And with that, I went off to the bathroom to clear my head, not to mention my nose. Yet miraculously, when I went down for breakfast the next morning, there was no mention of the bitter war of words that had waged so fiercely just hours before. The nightmare that had threatened to rip my world apart like an experienced chef portioning up a ball of mozzarella had somehow been averted. It was the 25th of October, 1962, and on the other side of the Atlantic, President J.F.K. Kennedy had just pulled the world back from the brink of nuclear war. Could I have just experienced my own personal Cuban Missile Crisis? Yes, I could have. And so, in summary, mine was a childhood of undeniable hardship, a chilling and far from delicious cocktail of neglect, solitude, domestic strife, and abuse. Naysayers have suggested that I'm dramatizing details of my early years because my publishers were concerned that my childhood was boring. How wrong they are. If anything, I am bravely playing down some of those hardships I faced in a way that critics might choose to describe as stoical. I was, if you like, a child called It. This was Alan's Ashes. A protagonist dealt a really shoddy hand by hard-hearted parents. They're dead now, and my mum's sister Valerie, who disputes my version of events pretty vociferously, has gone medically demented, so I'm really the gospel here. But it wasn't all foul-tasting. For example, I remember the intense joy I felt when my father slipped on some cake and cracked his head open. It was the day of my 9th birthday, and as I sat effortlessly reading a book aimed at 11 to 12-year-olds, I heard a commotion. It was my father. "Delivery for Mr. Partridge! Delivery for Mr. Partridge!" he was saying. He meant me rather than himself, although he could have eliminated the obvious ambiguity by saying Alan Partridge or Master Partridge. My instincts told me that he was using the third person, so probably did mean me. I ran into the kitchen, and there was my father, normally so cruel, as I think I've made abundantly clear, holding a cake. It was a ruby-red birthday cake with my name piped onto it in reasonably accomplished joined-up writing. I could barely contain my excitement, more at the cake than the writing. I adored cakes, but was only allowed to eat any on special occasions, such as after meals. I began to run over, licking my lips as I sprinted. Although blessed with cat-like coordination, something made me lose my bearings. Perhaps I'd been pushing myself too hard with the book for 11 to 12-year-olds, and my brain was scrambled. Whatever it was, I misjudged my proximity to the table and clattered against it. The cake fell from it and smashed on the floor in a hail of crumbs and redness and cream. My father surveyed the scene, his face slowly crumpling with anger. He crouched down, taking the weight of his body on his 2 haunches, and then he addressed me. "You'll never amount to anything," he said. "You're that to me." And on the word that, he held his finger and thumb 1, maybe 2 centimeters apart, as if to say, "Not very much." I didn't know what to say, my mind blasted by the twin concerns of spilt cake and parental cruelty. He turned to go and put one of his angry feet on the remains of the cake. This acted as a lubricant, destroying any traction/friction his foot might have had with the floor. It shot forward, and with his balance now a distant memory, he came crashing to the floor. His back took the first hit, smashing against the lino and cake with a bang. Bang! His rump was next. Doof! Followed by his skull. Crack! And for a second, he was motionless, before blood began to spill from the back of his head. As my father lay on the ground, the tension, much like the physical integrity of Dad's skull, was broken. Suddenly all the years of neglect which could easily have made a book in its own right, and definitely a film, were lifted. The hardship, the loneliness, the disappointment squeezed out of my eyes in the form of hot salt tears. Was I crying or laughing? I didn't know. All I knew was that these tears felt like a monsoon on a parched African savanna, to the delight of a proud but easy-going black farmer. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. I'm back at that tree as an 8-year-old child, my nose still bleeding, but it should scab up in a few minutes. All those childhood thoughts are racing through my mind, even though some of the incidents haven't yet happened, so would only have raced through my mind in a very vague form. These hard hardships, testing trials, and tricky tribulations are the things that have made me who I am. Like this tree, I am different. I have staying power, strength, nobility, staying power, and the ability to branch out. I wait for the bleeding to stop. It has done. Now. The cathartic cleansing effect of rapid blood loss has made me feel elated, and I returned to school to face what proved to be a pretty massive bollocking. I didn't care. Something had been ignited in me. I still return to that tree once a year. It's been bulldozed now to make the car park of Morrison's. I like to think it was pulped to make the very pages you're reading now if you were reading it in book form and not listening to the audiobook. But I still stand there each year, smack bang in the middle of a disabled parking bay, and remember its leafy majesty. We've both had our knocks, My TV career was bulldozed by a short-sighted commissioner who I'm delighted to say is now dead. But we retain the indefinable quality of excellence. And I think back to that turning point, that fulcrum of my early years, when I first fully realized what I had, where I was going, and who I was. I was Alan Partridge. 2. Scouts and Schooling. I joined Lord Baden-Powell's army of prepubescents, and it is an army, in the heyday of the Boy Scouts. In those days, we were truly legion. Some say there were close to 1 million UK Scouts in the early 60s, a terrifying proposition if you imagine them all running at you across a field, or chanting Ging-Gang Ghoulie again and again and again and again, but slightly louder each time. Even among such a vast number, I stood out as quite an outstanding officer in the North Norwich district, HQ'd in Cottersea. I excelled at outdoor tasks, mastering knots that could, theoretically, lash a small boat to a jetty or splice together a child's shattered leg, identifying clues to help me track a stricken comrade, spotting dock leaves from 50 paces. But I was even more adept at the domestic chores that scouting taught. I could embroider badges onto the shirts of every scout who asked, and was an absolute whiz at buffing shoes, tying neckerchiefs, and adjusting woggles. I might as well admit now, before any member of my troop publishes a counter-memoir, that I never mastered firelighting. I admit that. I couldn't do fires. I could build them into sturdy wigwams of sticks and newspaper, no problem, but I found it very, very hard to make them catch fire. In fact, I still can't, which is why gas barbecues are such a blessed relief. I'm often asked, what do scouts do? Well, although highly trained and physically fit, scouts are not invited to defend Britain in an international conflict. Instead, much of our effort went into the production of our annual gang show, my first taste of showbiz. My aptitude for knot tying meant that I was called into action as a stagehand, hoiking up scenery panels, then lowering them down again. I was good at it, and felt no real calling to be on stage, until the night of our first show. Scout leader Dave Millicent was MC. Smartly dressed and with his hair parted to one side, he worked the crowd beautifully and introduced each term with a real panache. He was, in a very real sense, a presenter that night. And it was at the show's pinnacle, as he queued up the backing track to Crest of a Wave and told them to take it away, that I think I first knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to present. Many years later, I contacted Dave and asked him to co-present my show on hospital radio, but he said he didn't want to do it and didn't remember who I was. Still, he was a good man and a very talented scout. What most appealed to me about the Scouts was that it was a true meritocracy. If you were diligent and resourceful and attended each week, you could orienteer your way to the very top. I'm proud to say I achieved the rank of patrol leader in no time, with 6 good scouts under my command. You'd think that this would automatically confer on me a bit of respect and obedience from others in the patrol. Sadly, many in the troop felt the scouting hierarchy only applied during our weekly meetings. One member of the troop, Phil Wiley, was in my class at school, and his behaviour towards me, a superior officer, was quite shameful. On one occasion he stole my swimming trunks, dropped them in a urinal, and laughed. This was in front of the whole class, many of whom were in my troop. Of course I couldn't let this slide, and I ordered him to rescue and wash them. He sniggered. I took a breath. "Do as I say," I said calmly. He began to walk away. "Do as I say, Scout Wiley," I boomed. "What did you call me? Scout Wiley?" He laughed again and indicated to the rest of the class that I was mentally defective by twirling a finger by the side of his head. Well, this was rank insubordination. "Do as I say. I'm your patrol leader." "Oh, my God," he attempted weakly. "I am your patrol leader. You are such a tit. I am your patrol leader. Fuck off." He actually said that to me. "I am your patrol leader. I am your patrol leader. I am your patrol leader. I am your patrol leader." I continued to shout this until I was the only